afternoon. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Caitlin Moorman, and I'm going to be talking about managing circularity in data projects, specifically how data projects and data products are different from more traditional software engineering work, and how managing to those differences can help improve your outcomes. So before we jump in, just a quick intro. I'm Caitlin Moorman. I'm currently Director of Product Analytics at Indigo Ag, which is an ag tech startup based in the US. And I'm a community leader at Locally Optimistic, which is a Slack community for data practitioners. I've been leading data teams for about 10 years now, across the board, from analytics and data platform to machine learning engineering teams. And I also want to throw a thanks out to Alexis Johnson Gresham, who is currently in product analytics at Reforge, and who collaborated with me on several blog posts and prior talks on this topic. So one of the reasons that all of us are here trying to learn from each other is that data work is hard. It's helpful to learn how other people are dealing with similar problems. And for me, the good news and the bad news at every conference that I go to is that the themes are really similar. We're not each individually failing to solve a problem. We're all trying to solve really hard problems. So I consistently hear from data practitioners that they have projects that never seem to end. They do an analysis. The results just yield 15 more questions that their stakeholders want them to answer next. Or they have very unclear stakeholder communication. Stakeholders don't clearly define what they're looking for, and data practitioners end up going down rabbit holes chasing the wrong answer. So instead of saying, I'm trying to make a decision about these two pathways, the stakeholder says, I want to see this data this way. And when they get that data, it doesn't actually answer the question they were trying to ask. They ask a different question. And you go down these rabbit holes with no clear success criteria in mind. But in a really good case, maybe you know what the goal looks like. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what it's going to take to get to a solution. So if you know the question, you have a hypothesis for how you'll answer it. You dig into the data, you come back, and that wasn't the answer. So you have another hypothesis, and you go down that path, and that wasn't the answer either. And you can dig into innumerable different hypotheses without getting any closer to the solution. And finally, there's a really real chance of failure in data work. You might go down all of the paths, and the question might not be answerable with the data that you have. You might not be able to build the model that predicts the outcome you want to predict. So I'm here today because I have found that you can mitigate some of these challenges by recognizing some of the unique ways that data work comes through an organization and applying some tactics to manage different types of projects more effectively. Most of us work in organizations that primarily build software. These organizations understand building software mostly. Generally, feasibility is fairly predictable. An engineer can tell you this is possible. There's a lot of unpredictability around delivery timelines. This is possible, but we don't know how long it will take to get there. We use Agile to cope with that. Break projects down, deliver what we can in a fixed window, deliver iteratively over time until we get closer to our goal. So most organizations still have some friction between engineering and the business around building software. But we've been dealing with similar challenges for long enough that we have started to build a shared language. We're making progress on managing it organizationally. One of the primary tools we use to manage these outcomes is Agile. The premise being that you can take that big goal with an uncertain timeline, break it down, and deliver user value incrementally over time. With each sprint, you're building on what you've done and getting closer to your ideal state. When you start to introduce data projects and data products into an organization, the folks around you start to expect similar results. They expect, if I ask a question, there's an answer. If we have data about a process, we can predict the outcomes of that process. It might take a long time. There might be a lot of effort involved, but eventually, this will work. The problem is that with data, that's actually just not true. Data work is fundamentally different than software engineering. And this difference applies to both analysis and building machine learning products. Some questions just can't be answered with the data that you have. But worse, you don't know which questions can't be answered until you get into the data. Sometimes we put a ton of effort into building a predictive model, and it turns out that the outcome isn't any better than guessing. It's certainly not good enough to put in front of users. And so we might spend a long time and put a lot of effort into a problem, and eventually we might still fail because it's just not possible with the data and methods that we have. So when we're trying to approach data work with an agile mindset, it feels really different. With each iteration, we learn something new, but it might not actually feel like we're delivering customer value. So we have a hypothesis, and we disprove it, and we come up with a new one. And then we disprove that one, we come up with a new one. We find the limits of the data. And in the end, we simply might decide that it's not possible today. And that's how you get yourself into an endless project. So something I found really useful in framing conversations around data work is sorting the uncertainty. In particular, I found the concept of a linear project and a circular project to be really helpful. The phrase originally comes from Agile Data Science with R by Edwin Thone, but the tactical recommendations we're going to go through are methods that Alexis and I have found helpful in our own teams. So first, let's talk about what I mean by a linear project. A linear project is closed-ended and has clear acceptance criteria. You understand what success looks like from the beginning, and the scope is relatively predictable. So in software engineering, a lot of those examples are just core feature work. It's building an orders portal for a customer. It's enabling product reviews. But there are also linear projects in data work. Some of this work is very predictable as well. You might build a dashboard based on a data set that you understand well and can predict what's possible. You can add a column to a table in a data warehouse. There are a lot of more engineering-oriented tasks in the data world that look a lot like a linear project. These projects tend to be easier because stakeholders have a linear mental model. They expect a project to have a clear beginning and a clear end, and to be relatively predictable in scope. And with these projects, Agile works reasonably well. You can be confident that each iteration is delivering value towards your goal. So for projects like these, a data team can work a lot like an engineering team and be successful. The other side of this is the circular project. Circular projects are open-ended and iterative. By that I mean later phases of the project depend on outcomes that you don't know at the outset. They tend to require understanding the content of the data in order to understand the scope. You don't know how big the project is going to be until you've actually gotten into the data to explore it. They may have fuzzy acceptance criteria. If the goal of a project is to understand why a trend in the business has changed, what do we mean by understand? What's enough? And they're potentially just not possible. Some questions can't be answered. Some models can't be built to a useful level of prediction with what you have on hand. But because data is complex and it's constantly changing, you won't know the outcome until you've put a fair amount of work into trying to answer the question. So because of these characteristics, a lot of Agile processes break down with circular projects. There's no guarantee that a particular iteration will actually yield value to your users. And that can be really frustrating and difficult to deal with organizationally. So let's talk about a couple of examples and how it tends to play out. Let's say we're trying to build a model to predict anything, maybe the likelihood that a customer will churn, or the likelihood that a supplier will fail to deliver the product they said they would. You have a hypothesis about what features are likely to be predictive. And if this is a business you've worked in for some time, you have a pretty good intuition of how high quality your data is around those features and how likely it is to be useful. But there's still a lot of work required to really understand whether your hypothesis is correct, whether it will give you enough signal to usefully predict the outcome. And someone on a data team might spend weeks and then at the end find out they're actually no closer to the goal than when you started. And then at that point, you have a few choices. You might start over with some new features that you think might help you predict this. You might have to go out and collect more data, either from your users or from external sources. Or you might have to decide that the project isn't worth it and stop working on it. All of those outcomes feel very unsatisfying, both to the data practitioners doing the work and to the business that was relying on it. I worked on a project like this when I led a data team for a crowdfunding platform. So in crowdfunding, we as the platform are relying on campaigners who are trying to bring a product to market to actually deliver the thing they said they're going to deliver. It's speculative, it's really early stage, and there are a lot of different failure modalities. There's a high risk that even someone who has a great idea, a great background, works really hard to make it happen, just doesn't. They fail because they didn't raise enough money. They fail because they didn't have quite the right expertise. They couldn't find the suppliers. There's a massive global supply chain issue. And so because we as a platform want to make things right for the backer, for the person contributing to the campaign, we say, we'd like to be able to quantify this risk. How likely is someone to deliver? And in trying to build a model to predict this, we took all the information that's available at the beginning of a campaign, all the information that's available to a backer at the time they make their decision. And trying this many times over several years while collecting additional data from the campaigners, expanding our universe of features, we could never predict it with better accuracy than just telling everyone our average rate of failure. And that level of investment in a project that ultimately isn't successful really didn't feel great. The other example that I want to talk through is the open-ended question. On the analytics side, these kinds of questions come to you quite regularly. So why did this metric change during this period? Why were sales down last month? Why were leads up so much? You probably, having worked with the business, have a general understanding of likely causes. You run through them. You see if those are the cause. Nope. After that, you have another guess. Maybe it's this more obscure potential cause. You research that. No. After that, you may or may not have a clear lead. You've ruled out the obvious cases, but you're going to have to dig a little deeper. So you're back in this situation of deciding, do I start over with a new hypothesis? Do I try to capture more data? Is there external data that might explain this? Is this like because of weather patterns? Is there some macroeconomic shift driving this? And so you could have, again, this choice of expanding your research, doubling down, digging deeper, or ultimately at some point deciding, this is the best that we can do. We're going to have to wait and see, is this a blip? Is this a real trend? What other data can we gather? And again, those outcomes feel really unsatisfying, both to the data team who really wants to be able to explain this trend, and to the business who really wants an answer. So when you're working on these circular projects, you're constantly having to decide, is this new hypothesis critical to success? Does it make it more likely that we're going to succeed? Is it a real opportunity? Is it a rabbit hole? And those questions really wear on a team. But when you're feeling down about it, remember they call it data science for a reason. So forming a hypothesis, testing it, iterating, that, it turns out, is the scientific method. Data work is circular when you're creating new knowledge about the world you operate in. It's the research side of our work. Engineering is different than research science. If you have a reasonably well understood code base, then an engineer can have a reasonably high level of confidence in what will happen, the feasibility of a new project, and generally a moderate level of confidence in the difficulty of the project before they embark on it. The world outside the code base is significantly less predictable. Trying to sort out the root cause of a changing business trend, trying to predict human behavior, trying to leverage a large and diverse and constantly changing data set for just about anything, that quickly moves into uncharted waters. So you don't want to shy away from circular work. There's a ton of value in it. We just want to learn to manage it better. So I'm going to go through a few tactical suggestions on how to manage the distinction between projects in order to get things done more effectively and with less friction from your stakeholders. We'll break it down into 3 things. First, just classifying projects, setting expectations, and then the team processes by which you manage work. So first, we just need to classify projects. There's a lot of power in naming things and in building an understanding within your organization of these 2 types of work. We've talked a lot about this over the past 10 minutes. So to sum it up, if you're confident it's possible, even if it's complicated, that's linear. If the outcome depends on data-related unknowns, things that won't become clear until you've put in a significant amount of work, that's circular. Once you've classified your project, it's important to start setting the right expectations with your stakeholders very early in the process. Help them understand why some projects aren't guaranteed to succeed. Help them understand why it requires so much work to understand if the project is likely to succeed. This is fundamentally different than the way they've been used to working. This is fundamentally different than their very long software experience. So it's really hard to over-communicate this, especially when you're first introducing the language into an organization. Once you've clarified the type of project, you'll spend a lot of time helping your stakeholders understand the sources of uncertainty, because that's what really differs in these projects, and that's what you really need to manage throughout. For linear projects, the sources of uncertainty are really around timeline. You'll find yourself using language like this. Part of the project is straightforward, but I'll need to investigate another part before I know how long the next stage will take. So your uncertainty is around your timeline. You might say, bringing the data into the warehouse, easy. I need to look at the data to understand how hard it's going to be to transform it. You're confident in your ability to achieve both of the tasks, but you have to figure out how long it's going to take. As you get into circular projects, then you have to make sure that you're not just communicating uncertainty around timelines, which is what people are accustomed to hearing, but that you're communicating very clearly uncertainty about the outcome itself. So you'll use phrases like, we'll start by investigating these hypotheses to try to determine why sales are up so much. But the answer might not be conclusive. And then we'll need to regroup to discuss what we found and collaboratively determine next steps. You might say things like, if we want to predict X, I'll need to explore our options for how to approach the project. I'll spend a day investigating some models, and then we can talk about next steps based on how complex different options are and how likely we would be to succeed with each. So again, uncertainty around the timeline for sure, but also uncertainty and variance in how likely you are to succeed based on how much time you invest into it. It might be language like this. No one's actually looked at that data in quite a while. I'd like to spend some time exploring it to understand whether we'll be able to answer your questions, and if so, how long it might take. Using these concrete phrases and making sure that people really hear that uncertainty around outcome can help your stakeholders have the right expectations of the project upfront. And then you'll make it better because you want to keep talking about the risk of failure. You'll want to have an upfront conversation around the fact that this risk of failure is real and how long it's reasonable to devote to the project before you decide that you haven't had success and it's time to give up. We think this project is worth 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks of investment. If we aren't seeing success at that point, we're ready to shift to a different priority. And then at each milestone throughout the project, focus on what was the outcome, what did we learn, and are we more or less confident in our ability to solve the problem? You compare that back to your timeline, and you might decide to call it early. You might say, you know, we said we'd give it 6 weeks, but we've gotten a satisfactory answer by 4, or we're 4 weeks in and it does not look like we're going to do this. We should really just pivot now. And the last area I'm going to talk about is your team processes. How can you change your tactical ways of working to make these circular projects less painful? Again, we've talked about how circular projects are the way that we're creating knowledge. So we're not trying to get rid of it. Our goals with team processes are, hey, I'm getting a little repetitive, I know, right? First, you classify the projects. You want everyone to understand what kind of work you're doing. Name it so you can manage it. Throughout all your processes, you want to drive alignment with stakeholders to prevent organizational churn around lack of progress or lack of success. If everyone understands the level of speculation within a project, the risk of failure, then it instead becomes, we have successfully learned. We have learned what is possible and what is not possible. Third, you want to try to convert circular projects to linear pieces where you can. A lot of times as you take on a circular project, there will be phases of it that start to look a little more linear, where you need to acquire data. You need to bring it into a data warehouse. You need to clean it. These things are sort of feasible. And when you manage them as a linear process, you can decrease your project uncertainty somewhat, but you can also decrease the churn around, well, is it going to be possible to find the data? Is it going to be possible to bring it in? Sort of where is the risk? And finally, your overall goal is to avoid those endless projects. You want to ensure that your process provides lots of points where you're encouraging either accepting good enough or calling a project a failure and pulling the plug. You want to make sure you're not stuck in an endless loop of responding to more questions, digging into new hypotheses, trying one more approach on the model with no end in sight. So let's get into just a couple tactical tools for improving how your teams work. These are actually all tools that are commonly used in Agile. But by taking this different approach of identifying what the circular project is, pairing these tools with that understanding, you can improve outcomes in communication and alignment in particular. The first is investing in requirements gathering. Generally, data teams aren't as good at this as engineering teams, especially on the analytics side. So implementing a better process around requirements can really help you drive clarity. Make sure that you understand what stakeholders are looking for and what they're going to do with it, because that helps you understand what does good enough mean instead of taking someone's word for it. On the product development side, this is the equivalent of listening to what a user tells you the feature should do instead of understanding what they're trying to accomplish. This is a well-known failure modality. So often having that 10 to 15 minute conversation up front with a stakeholder can save a data team a lot of work time, as well as improving the quality of the output, making sure that you're putting the right amount of effort against a problem, and dealing with those situations where a stakeholder says they need this very specific data output when what they really need is an answer to this business question that might be able to be handled very differently and in a much more simpler way. The second tool is using exploration phases, or spikes. So if you're not familiar with it, a spike is a time-bound research project to get a better sense of how challenging the unknown aspects of a task might be. A spike helps you understand what's easily answerable, what might be more difficult, and it helps you revise your estimates of both feasibility and timeline. So you might say, this sprint, I'm going to spend 1 day investigating this area of the data to understand how hard the request is going to be to answer, or how hard the model is going to be to build. I'm going to research different approaches we could take and what that might mean for our success. So the output of a spike is not the answer itself. It's a recommendation on what the right next step is and a better clarity around what we know about feasibility. The third tool is design sprints. Design sprint methodology is very well documented. So if you're interested in looking into it more, I highly recommend it. But generally speaking, the intention is to take a very open-ended question or a very open-ended project, quickly narrow down to a reasonable area of focus, prototype that solution with a pretty low resolution, and align on how to move forward. So in many ways, it's a lot like a spike, but for a big open-ended project or a not well-scoped project, a design sprint specifically brings together stakeholders in that time-boxed period and gives you a great structure to get folks aligned around questions like, what's actually the minimum viable product here? What are we really trying to accomplish? And what's the next best step we could take based on that? Which is closely related to the last tool I'm going to talk through, which is the smallest meaningful iteration. Sometimes you can take a circular project, a really big question, like what is this happening? Why is this happening? What are our customer archetypes and what do they do in the product? These very big open-ended analytical questions that often come up and very much are prone to this circular hypothesis testing. Instead, you might say, what are we actually trying to answer and what's the smallest amount of work we can do to start to make progress toward that? How can we get feedback throughout the process, answer the first question, see if we're on the right track, and continue through? How can we understand when we've gotten that 80% of the value so that we can move on to the next project? For machine learning projects, this is often also, what's the most basic heuristic we could use to predict this? What if we just told everybody our overall risk of failure? How does that affect the customer experience? Do people have a more realistic expectation? Do they really need to know whether each project is successful? So here, I'm just rolling it all back together. The key pieces to managing circularity and data workflows. First, classify the projects as linear or circular. Set expectations around where the uncertainty is and what failure might look like. And the 4 tactical ideas for how to adjust your team processes to improve outcomes on circular projects. Really investing in robust requirements gathering, leveraging spikes and design sprints, and focusing on the smallest meaningful iteration for an analysis. I found this framework to be really helpful in bringing more clarity to stakeholder communication, bringing more clarity to the team, and honestly just highlighting why some projects and data feel so hard. So I found that thinking through the distinction can help your team be more effective, but maybe more importantly, feel more effective and find more satisfaction in their work. So I hope that you found it helpful. There's a link to the slides there, and thanks for listening. Oh, yes, I do have time for that. Yeah, so just repeating the question for the recording, it was around how you can really measure the value and understand when you've provided enough value from the data team. So what I find really helpful is to really force people to, on the analytics side specifically, to talk about what decision they're trying to make. What will be different based on the data that we give you? If you're trying to decide whether to build feature A or feature B first, we can give you enough information to make that decision. If you're trying to decide whether to shift the marketing investment from here to here, we can focus on that and focus on really what's going to make a difference. And as you dig in, you'll often find you're either in the realm of very material, and the answer is obvious, or immaterial, and you should probably go on your gut anyway. And when you frame this decision-based analysis value, then you start to understand pretty quickly, like, what will change? If this answer comes back and looks like this or like this, what are you really going to change based on that? And hopefully sort of cut it off. I think with model building, it's usually easier because you have a more clear product goal in mind. So we want to improve conversion by recommending better products. And you can start to see whether each iteration of a model is really getting you any material gain on that. And that can be a little easier to measure value. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is an area where I'm going to fully cop out and say, I think if you try to solve any why question, is this the right problem, with pure quantitative research, you're really missing out. And that's where hopefully you have a really good user research team and you can lean on qualitative research to start to say, we have this hypothesis, let's run it by a couple of actual humans and understand, does that fit the need? Does this fit the need? Like, are we even solving the right problem? Do we understand why no one makes it from stage A to stage B? Awesome. Thank you so much.